Good morning again, everyone, and welcome to today's forum brought to you by PolicyBridge and in partnership, I should say, with the Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University. My name is Randell McShepard, and I am the chairman and co-founder of PolicyBridge, a public policy think and action tank established in Cleveland in 2004. Our work has centered over those years on researching, analyzing, and responding to public policy from an African-American perspective and or other disenfranchised community perspective. PolicyBridge has focused its work on core policy issues that affect quality of life in areas including economic development, workforce development, health disparities, housing and neighborhoods, criminal and social justice, and the topic at hand for today's conversation, education. Our think tank has released over 18 reports and policy briefs over the years, addressing all those aforementioned topics. And after so many years of research, we started to really see bigger trends that we thought were standing in the way of progress in our fair city. And I'll share just a few of them with you that stand out. Number one, most of our challenges and urban problems are intersectional, which means that you can't work on one problem without having to address a myriad of interrelated problems. And I think we will hear a bit more about that from our panelists as we go into the conversation. The second point, while there are many great organizations, including nonprofits, foundations, corporations, and governmental entities that are making, in some cases, incremental gains, and in a few cases, even significant gains, the city as a whole has remained at the top of too many negative indicators and lists that track those indicators, including recently being noted as the #1 city in poverty, childhood poverty, adult poverty, also being a terribly disconnected digital city. And one publication even cited the city of Cleveland as the worst place in America for Black women. So obviously there's a lot more work to be done. The third point I would add, and final point in this regard, is that a good part of the problem that we face here in Cleveland, we believe at PolicyBridge is a result of a lack of cohesion as it relates to how we determine and track success. If everyone defines success differently, I believe we wind up with successful initiatives, but a broken and divided city. So with all of this in mind, PolicyBridge released a document calling for an urban agenda that would draw from collective impact strategy. That document was titled Resetting the Table, an Urban Agenda for Cleveland, and was released late last year. Today's forum is titled Building an Educational Ecosystem to Fuel Growth in Cleveland's Economy. And we will be taking a closer look at the role that education plays in getting and keeping our city on track. What's working in education? What's standing in the way? How are we preparing our next generation of workers for the ever-evolving economy? These are the types of questions that we will delve into as part of today's discussion. You should also note, ladies and gentlemen, that today's forum is the second of a 4-part series in partnership with the Levin College that we will be producing. So we want you to keep your ears to the ground for future forums, and please plan to join us as you hear about those. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce my good friend, my partner in crime, my brother from another mother, Greg Brown, who is the executive director of PolicyBridge and has been for many years. Greg was also the very first board member that I recruited when we first established PolicyBridge 18 years ago. So I've grabbed a hold of him and I'm not gonna let him go. But Greg is twice degreed at the wonderful Levin College of Urban Affairs. He served as an adjunct faculty member there. He has a successful consulting firm, Greg Brown & Associates. He has worked and has a rich background in the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. He's one of the smartest guys I know, and he's a dear friend, and will do a wonderful job moderating today's discussion. So, Mr. Brown, the show is yours, my good friend.
Thank you so much, Randy. And I'll send that money along to you in an envelope shortly.
I'll be looking for it.
Well, good morning. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce the guests for our panel discussion and the goal for this morning's discussion as well. Starting with the goal of this discussion, it is to identify what changes must be made to provide Cleveland students the access to education and training necessary and create a pipeline to rewarding and family-sustaining careers. After our February forum, we polled attendees about what should be the topic for our next forum. One of the topics that ranked at the top of their responses was educational attainment and career launching. So we will focus on improving and strengthening education ecosystem connections today. Now let me first introduce our panelists. One of our announced panelists, Autumn Russell, Executive Director of the Greater Cleveland Career Consortium, is unable to participate with us today due to being ill. We certainly want to wish Autumn a speedy recovery. So now let me introduce the rest of our esteemed panel. First, Dr. Roland V. Anglin, Dean of the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University. Dean Anglin is recognized for his scholarly and applied work in the area of economics and community development. Dean Anglin is a passionate advocate for public policies and community-based strategies that create social and economic opportunity for marginalized communities and people. Prior to his appointment as dean, Dr. Anglin was senior advisor to the chancellor of Rutgers University at Newark and director of the Joseph C. Cornwell Center for Metropolitan Studies, an applied research institution at that university. Our second guest today is Dr. Michael A. Baston. He is president-elect of Cuyahoga Community College. Dr. Baston began his career as a public interest lawyer representing various educational institutions and social justice organizations. His work with academic clients led him to pursue a second career in academia as both a professor of legal studies and business, and as a student affairs administrator. Dr. Basson has served as the president of Rockland Community College in New York since 2017. Under his leadership, he's helped that college launch several academic and workforce development related programs and initiatives. In May, the Board of Trustees of Cuyahoga Community College announced that Dr. Batson will become Tri-C's 5th president. He will succeed Dr. Alex Johnson, who will step down June 30th. And our last guest, and certainly not the most important, my good friend and longtime partner working in education, CEO at the Cleveland Municipal School District, Mr. Eric Gordon. Eric Gordon was appointed Chief Executive Officer of the Cleveland Metropolitan School District in June 2011, after serving as the district's Chief Academic Officer for 4 years. He is responsible for the leadership and daily management of Cleveland's 35,600 students in the school district. In July 2012, Mr. Gordon led a citywide coalition to develop Cleveland's Plan for Transforming Schools, or the Cleveland Plan, which has resulted in dramatic improvement in academic performance over the last decade, including a 29 percentage point gain in graduation rates to a record 80.9%. Following years of decline in post-secondary enrollment for CMSD students, despite the increasing graduation rates, Mr. Gordon then led a citywide coalition to bring Say Yes to Education to Cleveland that for the next 25 years will make CMSD students eligible for a full tuition scholarship upon graduation. After launching the Say Yes scholarships, CMSD saw its first increase in post-secondary education enrollment in 5 years, from 44% to 49%. So, gentlemen, let me welcome you this morning. Let me thank you for participating in our discussion. I'd like to make a few comments, after which I'd like each of you to spend 5 to 7 minutes reflecting and responding to the context setting comments that I would like to make. So as Randy said earlier, in our Resetting the Table, an Urban Agenda for Cleveland document released in November of 2021, we call out as a community priority the need to address the challenges and the need for a connected education ecosystem. The Urban Agenda is a call for coordinated and integrated planning, collective action, and accountability. Using network systems, commonly known as collective impact, we will achieve positive outcomes for all people in our community. Collective impact has 5 essential elements to achieve success, and they are common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and backbone support. These 5 elements outline how to engage in work to achieve systems level improvements. In our report, we start to talk about that even before the pandemic, the workforce system was subject to constant changes. There are increasingly marked differences in the lifetime earnings for those who graduate high school and those who do not. More employers want new employees to come prepared to work with skills, so the pressure has been put on school systems to prepare students directly for the workforce. Many of the largest workforce sectors in Ohio don't pay a living wage or provide benefits. And due to the cost of education, more parents and students are demanding that schools prepare students with more attention to the workforce and not just general education. Cleveland's economy has faced high unemployment rates in marginalized communities and is facing stiff headwinds in attracting new businesses. And since the pandemic, there have been even more changes, such as virtual work, which has emerged as an alternative to being in the workplace itself. Also, large employers are creating their own job training programs and questioning the need to go through the higher education system. So, gentlemen, with this as a backdrop, given my perspective, I would like each of you to provide a few minutes of discussion on the topic for our forum today: building an educational ecosystem to fuel growth in Cleveland's economy. From your vantage point and from your expertise. And to begin the discussions today, I would like to invite the CEO of the Cleveland Municipal School District, Eric Gordon, to begin. Eric?
Thanks, Greg, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me on your panel today. I think it's really smart to start with K-12 first and then build upon that as we watch our future workforce grow into our community colleges, our universities, and our workforce. I would start where you left off in introducing me, Greg, with the introduction of Say Yes to Education, which occurred in January of 2019. While that was really important, that all of our students have access to full tuition scholarships to Cuyahoga Community College and other two-year colleges, to public universities like Cleveland State University, and to Pell eligible training programs like Polaris Career Center as an example. It also revealed that even with tuition support, half of our students are looking toward post-secondary and the other half are not. They're going into the workforce, they're going to the military, they're doing something other than post-secondary. And we graduate 2,000 new potential employees a year. But when we look at what the traditional American K-12 system does for high school students as they're getting ready to graduate, if you signal that you are going to college, you've completed your FAFSA, you've applied, you get all kinds of support in your school. You get career guidance counselors helping you write your scholarship letters, you're filling out your applications, helping get that FAFSA done, getting you to college tours. So much happens around the young person who's indicated an interest in post-secondary. But if you take a look at what's happening for a student who has not indicated that interest and therefore is likely going to the military, going to the workforce directly, there's almost no support system in a typical American high school. And so that really challenged my team and members of our community to really think again about what are we doing for that other half. The 1,000 kids a year that are not going into a post-secondary pathway immediately after high school. So in September of 2019, we kicked off a team to really research this, a cross-functional team that included employers, included Tri-C and Cleveland State and other degree granting agencies, included the workforce connecting agencies, youth connecting agencies, kids themselves, and really tried to see what were the pipelines and what were the supports that would move young people into quality jobs, opportunity jobs, good jobs, high-skilled jobs that lead to those family-sustaining careers that you mentioned. And over the course of a little over 2 years, we've created a new program in the district called PACE, Planning and Career Exploration, that really helps our young people be much more deliberate in thinking about what their passions are and how those passions can connect to careers that lead to family-sustaining wages. To do that, we identified 3 fundamental shifts in practice that we had to make happen. The first is actually reframing the challenge. In most American high schools, there's a rhetoric of college and career or college or career, but they are bifurcated. There are 2 separate things. We had to reframe the challenge as career, and that college is certainly a pathway to career, and you'll hear about a lot of the technical certificates, associate's degrees, bachelor degrees, and other opportunities that our colleges and universities provide. But there's also micro-credentialing, apprenticeships, internships, and straight to the workforce opportunities that also can lead to good opportunity jobs or high-skilled job careers. So the first was reframing that pathway and thinking that all 2,000 students should be on a career path, even if they're not choosing a post-secondary formal pathway to identify that family-sustaining career. The second was getting more specific about the broad rhetoric of awareness, exploration, and planning that is prevalent in the K-12 education system. So awareness and exploration is very important in a breadth and depth sort of way, particularly in kindergarten through 5th grade, and really getting to know what kinds of opportunities are out there in a big picture sort of way. But then by middle school, that awareness and exploration has to become more deeply defined in choice making and active planning. And by that middle school, starting to screen what things I really like, what things I really don't like, what do I know about myself and don't know about myself, so that I can start refining what things I'm going to explore more deeply. And so, for example, if I've learned that I'm an introvert, I probably should be steered away from sales. But if I'm an introvert who loves science and math and weather, maybe I better be exposed to not meteorology on TV, but meteorology at the airport, where I actually can be introverted, sitting in my cube, doing my job to get aircrafts where they need to be without having to be on television, and start getting students aware that their passions can connect to real choices and that they can start actively planning. As they move into high school, then we need to have a broad introduction to short-term work-based learning experiences, both in school and out of school. So this is trips to visit, shadowing days, employers coming in and talking with us, that sort of thing. But by junior and senior year, we actually need to be participating and trying on those career passions and making sure they fit and learn to earn internships, apprenticeships, all with a support system that we actually hope will drive many more young people into post-secondary pathways, whether they be short-term credentialing or longer-term degree granting, and creating access to those good and opportunity jobs. And then finally, making sure that we organize an ecosystem of K-12, higher ed, public sector and philanthropy, employers and industry, and workforce and youth serving nonprofits all working together. And to do that, in March of 2022, we actually launched the Greater Cleveland Career Consortium, which is our collective impact response to these challenges that we've faced. And I look forward to talking about this with my colleagues here and with you, Greg, in more detail in a few minutes. So thank you.
No, thank you, Eric. Lots of meat on that bone and lots of things to think about to get us started. I'd like to now offer Dr. Basson an opportunity to provide some perspective based on the context that I said or any other things that he thinks are necessary to help us stimulate some communication and conversation this morning.
Well, Greg, certainly I'm happy to join you today and to this great group. Wonderful opportunity for me now as I transition to the presidency of Cuyahoga Community College. Very excited to hear a lot of what Eric has been speaking about. Around this country, I've been helping community colleges and others in the K-12 space, as well as the four-year in university space, business and industry, figure out how we work better together. How are we very intentional about our collaborations? How are we very intentional about the outcomes that we have together? And so I believe very firmly in the collective impact strategy, because if we have those defined terms that we all agree to and appropriate measurements and milestones, we actually can make significant progress in improving the lives of our community by helping to make sure that access is really more than just availability. Oftentimes you will find that folks will say, well, we've got these access centers, or we've got, workforce areas, we've got training programs, we've got all of these things, which is wonderful. But a collection of tactics is not a strategy. If we are not very careful, we will have availability, which is important, but not access. Access means not that I can have access to fill out the FAFSA form. Access means I have someone who's going to translate the questions, who's going to help me navigate filling out the form, who's going to actually help me make the connections that I need to make to get to the places that I need to go. Many years ago, for many years, community colleges have been seen as through organizations, that we actually are a pass-through from the K-12 system or a pass-through from an adult education program into ultimately a four-year institution. And that has been a lot of what we have done in the past. But today, community colleges are very different. We really are partners with all of the sectors, as well as the learner, as that learner's career partner for life. And so whether they decide to go into the four-year institution or into a workforce opportunity, we have a goal for every single student, regardless of age. And that goal is to make sure that they have economic mobility, that they have a clarity in terms of the path that they desire to go on, that we want to make sure that I get credit for all of their experiences. And so we have in this country 24 million people who have some college and no degree. No doubt in Cleveland, I'm sure we have a significant number of members, as your report points out, that have some college and no degree. And so what are we doing to say that when you left college, that you did have experiences? How do we give you credit for those experiences? How do we help you then get on another path that will lead you to that family sustaining and supporting wage so that your family can have the life that they deserve and you can live your American dream? And so from my perspective, we have to continue to build these partnerships in very intentional ways. where I come from, we have a relationship, a very close relationship with our school districts, where we're doing career development and navigation in partnership with the high school while they're in high school, giving them college credit so that we can reduce the time to degree completion and making sure that folks actually get college credit as part of their navigation strategy. Very, very important work. We also believe that the transition with our four-year university partners is equally as important. How do we make sure that we have what I call equitable transfer, that we can help to diversify all of our partner institutions by ensuring that the academic programs that are built at our institution actually are ladders to the next journey for a student who goes into those institutions. And so that means that there has to be a greater connection with financial aid between our institutions, a greater connection with our enrollments at both institutions, greater connections with the ways in which our faculty work together, greater connections with advising so that the students can be advised in our college for their next chapter so that they don't have to take credits that ultimately don't transfer and that they can move more speedily at a lower cost to get the degrees. And then ultimately, if they need, to come back to us for certificates to advance in their careers. And so oftentimes we have to recognize we are all in a reset period. The reset is not just in K-12. The reset is not just in business and industry. The reset is also in educational corporations. In this community, you have 7 or more new leaders who are coming to take the leadership of major institutions in this community. And how wonderful it would be that we would continue to work together so that as all of these institutions go through this reset phase, prompted in part by the pandemic, but also by the demographic droughts that we're facing and the job shortages, the worker shortages. Wouldn't it be wonderful if, as each are beginning to do resets, that we think about how we each can help each other in those resets, that how we can be those important partners to move Cleveland forward. Intel that's going to Columbus. There are going to be opportunities here in Cleveland that we have to capitalize because there are a myriad of opportunities for people that are prepared to receive them. So I'm excited to work with our partners in both systems. I'm excited to work with our business and industry. I'm excited to recognize the fact that this is a seminal moment for Cleveland. And if we lean in together, we can erase some of the have and have not realities that your report points out.
Well, thank you so much. And once again, welcome to our community. We're glad to have you here. And I think that what you talked about in terms of the new leadership is critically important. It was also opportune for us as we were putting this document together because we believe in that same concept. We have to if we can cobble together the leadership to think differently and reset their table, then we can align different aspects of the work, but also be more inclusive about who else needs to sit at the table and how we better connect those aspects of that work to the work that we want to do so that we can have not just community impact and population impact, but we really see change for the better in a positive way in our neighborhoods. So thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to offer Dean Anglin an opportunity to respond as well. Roland, please.
Thank you, Greg. And it's truly an honor to be on a panel with Eric Gordon and Dr. Baston. I'm going to confine my remarks to public higher educational institutions and the central question here, what are the challenges and the need for connected education ecology? We all know that post-secondary education and training have become major paths to economic opportunity. I think it's over 2/3 of the jobs require at least some post-secondary education, training, or credential. But the increasing need for post-secondary attainment brings its own challenges. I'm a fanboy of Anthony Carnevale, who's director and research professor at Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. He notes in a recent paper that today's post-secondary education and training system has become a new gear wheel, arguably the biggest gear wheel in the American race and class inequality machine. That surprised me because those are fighting words for those of us who believe in the power of post-secondary attainment. But some context. Carnevale and his colleagues found that a child from a low-income family who has the top test scores in kindergarten has a 31% chance of graduating from a four-year college and getting a good job by age 25. Again, they found that a child from a low-income family who has the top test scores in kindergarten has a 31% chance of graduating from a four-year college and getting a good job by age 25. Ironically, they found that a child with low test scores in grade school who comes from a family in the top income quartile has a 71% chance of doing the same. This is very sobering and led Carnevale and his colleagues to conclude that post-secondary education and training mimics and indeed magnifies the inequality that is inherent in the pre-K to 12 system. He goes on to say it then projects this inequality into labor markets, housing markets, and local school districts, guaranteeing the intergenerational transmission of race and class privilege. So the total summary here is it's not enough to trumpet post-secondary attainment as the end goal for economic development or economic opportunity. Successful post-secondary education outcomes means building and nurturing a different type of ecology. This new ecology, as I'm calling it, has to be self-aware, has to be continually addressing problems such as poor nutrition, access to good housing, education, health, all in a connected, intentional, and accountable way. Let me just speak about the challenges for higher education, especially public higher education institutions playing in this ecology building space. As a sector, we face our own looming challenges, such as dipping enrollments brought by a shrinking pool of traditional age college students. The public and their elected officials are asking us tough questions regarding sector relevance. And every once in a while, you hear that come through, and we hear periodic calls for a 3-year BA. This should not dissuade public higher educational institutions from pursuing what a mentor of mine called what we are called to do. It is my belief that we are called as a sector to think and act creatively on the challenges facing the communities in which we are embedded, including playing a role in reducing social and economic inequality. Well, what does that mean? First of all, I think public higher educational institutions have to accept the demographic reality that there is no one age or class niche that will bolster enrollments over time. Things are fluid, and we have to tailor our efforts to attracting and retaining a wide variety of students. The reality is we cannot leave anyone behind, and thus we have to find ways to nurture and credential lifelong learning and other ways of creating opportunity. Strategically, we have to learn how to collaborate with other sectors on changing opportunity structures upstream before it gets to be a problem downstream. And I think we're going to talk more about this in the Q&A. Lastly, I'm not sure that public higher educational institutions use one of their best superpowers, and that is our ability to convene. That superpower is perhaps at the base of collective impact. And I look forward to discussing it more with those on the panel and in the audience. Thanks, Greg.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You really did bring into context this idea about not just the idea of the changing environment and this paradigm shift towards trying to figure out how do we really create the kind of ecosystem that is beneficial for people in the community, but in fact, how do we think about it differently Because if we don't think about it differently, we certainly cannot design anything that will be change oriented or necessary to demonstrate those things that we think are important to the constituents we have. I'd like to thank all three of you for helping to flesh out more of this conversation this morning. We're going to move into some questions that I would like to ask each of you, and feel free to provide comments. But before we do that, I'd like to inform those of us on the webinar or participating in the webinar today that if you do have a question or a comment, please feel free to put your questions or comments in the question and answer button, using that question and answer button instead of the chat, so that we will be able to see it and we will try to respond to it before we conclude today. So gentlemen, my first question really goes back to all of you have kind of talked about what's going on and what you've seen. And this question is for all of you, but I want you to think about it. What's missing? What are some ways that we can improve on our current efforts or strengthen our work, especially by utilizing partners from other sectors?
Well, I would say in terms of what's missing, the question is really more who's missing. We know about the groups that are already within our systems, but we are not as clear, I think, in terms of who's not engaging, who is being left out. Everyone in this community is not being educated. Everyone in this community is not in a training program. Everyone in this community is not in the best position. So the question is, with all the different community-based organizations, all the different educational institutions, all the different ways in which we are seeking to serve students, how is it that we still have many who are not involved in some meaningful way in one of these systems? How is it that we are not in a position today to ensure that many of the positions that are viable and available in our community we're not preparing those people for those opportunities because they are not in the system? We can speak very clearly about the folks that are in our various systems, but I'm not so sure that we have as much information as we will need about those who are currently disconnected. Our new immigrants in our community that are disconnected, folks that have sort of not really navigated with success for long-term in these systems. How do we reconnect with them? We have schools all over this city. We have our institutions. I've got 4 campuses, and Cleveland State has many wonderful doors that I've traveled around the city and seen. How are we making sure that people who are passing by these different doors every day that are not currently connected to us in meaningful ways, any of our systems, how do we make sure that they know that they are welcome, that they are wanted, and that we really can help them get to the places where they want to be?
I would build on what Dr. Baston shared with not only making sure that we have the right people having access, but really also asking about where the balance is in the system. So right now, there is a clear bias toward what the employer wants and what the employer permits that creates who has access and does not have access. And so we have to really examine all parts of the system to really understand how each part of the system currently works, and then how we get it to work differently to get to what we want it to achieve, because we know systems are designed to do exactly what they're doing and do it very well. So when we were looking at what our career exploration work at the very beginning, we looked at how employers were trying to find new employees. And we really challenged employers. I talked with one employer who really wanted tradespeople for the properties that he owns, and was asking why the school district doesn't train in the trades. And I explained that we do. We have a career center called Max Hayes. And I said, what are your hiring criteria? And he said, well, you have to be 21 years old. And I said, well, stop. You've already determined that none of my graduates can work for you for at least 3 or 4 years. And by the time that they are ready to work for you, they have found some other employment. I've heard employers say our young people don't have employability skills. Okay, 75% of my high school students hold a part-time job. So they certainly have some employability skills because they are not being fired from those jobs. They're working those jobs, right? Equally, I went to my students and said, where do you find jobs? Well, they don't look for jobs where employers post jobs. So now we're talking past each other, right? Went to the youth serving agencies and the workforce agencies who their job is to make the connections. And they said, well, if we can get them there, we'll get them into the job. So I bust kids into the system and flooded the system, and predictably it failed because it's not designed to make those connections in the way we think it is, right? So I think that we really have to create a balance of that the employer can get what he or she needs, but that it's equally easy for the employee to find what he or she needs. And right now that is out of balance, and it's balanced on the side of the employer. And it means every system examining, right? So CMSD and K-12 is not, somehow out of this. K-12 is an example. We have to stop thinking in terms of school district boundaries. There is not an employer in this region that wants to have 7 different strategies for 67 different school districts in Cuyahoga County alone. So how do we create an ecosystem for Northeast Ohio that does not think of what does it look like in Maple Heights and in Richmond Heights and in CMSD, but what does it look like in our region? So even school districts have to rethink this balance of what authorities we have and what authorities we need to give up. So I think there's a lot of examining not just who are the partners at the table, but what is it that they contribute that either enables access or disables access for the employees that we're looking for.
I would echo what Eric Gordon and Dr. Baston said. I think if we're establishing a collective impact system or ecology, we often get overwhelmed by the thought of multiple partners who speak different disciplinary languages and different programmatic languages. And that often limits our attempts at collective impact. I think if we want to build this system, we have to accept that we have to learn about each other's individual ecology and use that knowledge to build a more robust system. But that takes time and effort. And sometimes we just want to gloss over process. And I've learned in my old age, you can't gloss over process.
That is so important because we were just having this discussion a couple of days ago, Randy and myself with some people from another local organization. So when we talk about collective impact, what are some of the challenges? Dean, you started to talk about some of the challenges as it relates to the fact that it takes a little bit more time. But what are some of the other challenges, and how do those challenges then become ameliorated in terms of thinking about the work that needs to be done and the fact that it can be more impactful if we really do design it properly?
Well, I always put collective impact in the framework of economics. It's high transaction costs. And so you have to figure out how you're going to lower your transaction costs to get people to the table. And that involves leadership, it involves preparation, it involves knowledge up front to say, we're going to encounter this barrier and this is the way we're going to control for it. It just means being very intentional about planning and execution for the model or the collective impact model. But again, as I said previously, there's no getting around the process, and it's slow, it's lumpy, and ultimately, you have to give up power for some of the sectors, and we're very reluctant to do that. So we have to learn new ways of working together if we want to have true collective impact.
Yeah, I would say A1. That's it. It is that we can't get in the room and be a whole bunch of individuals continuing to do exactly what we've already done and think we're going to get a different result. We do have to be willing to self-examine and change. And that requires courage, that requires will. We've been using collective impact models in Cleveland in the education sector, not connecting to the workforce until recently, but in the education sector for 15 years. And people from all over the country have come and said, wow, this is really great, but we couldn't do this in blank city. And if you come into the city saying we can't do this because we won't work together, then you shouldn't bother, because the whole point is you're doing something together that you cannot do individually. But that does mean then being willing to self-examine and to be willing to change what your institution contributes compared to what it would have done on its own. And that often does appear to be a giving up of power. I actually would argue it's more powerful when you're willing to say, I don't need to own that because the collective can. It actually also creates a shared accountability where the sectors can't continue to point around the table and say, well, you know, Tri-C would be having higher grad rates if CMSD was sending us a better student, and Cleveland State would have better grad rates if Tri-C was. If we're a collective impact model, to Dr. Baston's earlier point, with shared goals, a shared vocabulary, and shared metrics, suddenly we're responsible for whether this is working or not. And it just changes the way you work, but it does require, you know, the courage and the will to behave differently. And that often is the paralysis that I see when people start talking about collective impact.
And as it relates to workforce specifically, we have to recognize that we're not just able to have conversations about workforce development. That's an old conversation. We've got to be talking about workforce innovation, because we have millions of Americans that don't want to work for somebody, that really want to work for themselves. They are involved heavily in the gig economy. So many of the students that you may not necessarily see in our local community college or in our public institution, four-year institution, you say, where's all of the folks? You know, where are they? Well, no, they're working, but many of them are working for themselves. They are driving Uber Eats and DoorDash. They are doing these other gig workers. 60 million Americans right now are doing this work. And so they are making that short-term economic choice as the alternative. And so we've got to recognize that they too are citizens of our community. They too need to be able to support their families. Many of them are working 3 of these gig jobs right now to try to make ends meet. So how do we make sure that the conversation doesn't forget those folks who are as extraordinarily as important as everyone else? How do we make sure that we are thinking about the entrepreneurial spirit in America? We used to have traditions in our country where you could only get your book published if you went to Simon & Schuster or one of these big houses. There used to be a time in America when you could only manufacture your goods if you had a big manufacturing deal, or you could only move your music if you had a company to give you a record deal. Well, you can go on iTunes now, you can do Etsy, you can broadcast yourself. You don't need someone to discover you. You can do your YouTube channel and get discovered that way. So the ways in which we've accessed rising in America is changing. We have to, together as educational partners and others, recognize the importance of the way the world has changed and what people in our communities, the access to opportunities to rise. And how do we then fortify that? Not simply say, well, that's not going to help you have a long-term life. You're not going to get a pension. All of that kind of stuff may be true, but we've got to recognize that the way you rise in America and the way that folks are rising in their community is different. And we can't simply try to use our conventional strategies in a world that is completely transformed. And, you know, the last recession, there weren't the DoorDashes and there weren't, you know, all of these alternative routes to actually rising in America. And so we've got to be open to the fact that there are folks that don't want to wait for the 1st and the 15th or the 15th and the 31st. They don't want to get paid every other week. They want 2 hours after they do Instacart to have money in the bank to take care of their family. And so we've got to recognize that that's a new calculus as a part of workforce innovation and not just simply development, because everyone doesn't want to work for someone. Many of our folks want to work for themselves. And we've got to be able to recognize how the educational process can support even that entrepreneurial American dream.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate this line of discussion, because I think it has uncovered something that I think is critically important about the work itself. And that is, before you can actually have people working towards change, they must go through some internal process, intellectual process, to understand differently. We call that perspective transformation, which shortly said is thinking and understand differently to act differently. And what is critically important is we seem to have an affinity recently to want to maintain the status quo because we're not only heavily invested in the status quo and we're comfortable in that status quo, but in fact, we have some semblance of power, stature, influence as it relates to that status quo. So how do we overcome the natural tendency towards the status quo, and how do we encourage you guys in the education sector, other leaders and other stakeholders to want to begin this perspective transformation to pursue a different orientation?
You simply look at the outcomes, you simply look at the participation, you simply look at the economic realities that are connected to participation that influence our areas, because if we don't think differently, we can't move our agendas to help people.
I think also we have to really challenge the notion that there is a fixed pool of resources, and therefore you have to get as much out of that fixed pool as possible. That's not how the economy actually works. Right. So including more people in a thriving economy does not necessarily mean others have to lose. This is not a win or lose because there is a fixed pie and I want as much of the pie as I can get. We actually know that by getting more people who have more credentials into good and opportunity jobs grows the pie. And so I think we also have to make, both the heart and head case about what we want and need for a community to be thriving, that, the more people that are in these good opportunity jobs and family sustaining wage jobs is also less people who are requiring us to provide resources for their entire life because we did them wrong at the beginning. So there's this moral imperative, but it's also just a good economic strategy because we know that growing the workforce, the quality of the workforce, and that's the whole question communities are arguing, right, is that we don't have the workforce we need. So we got to remind people of that very question that they're trying to answer so that we can reframe that, continuing to keep people trapped in poverty while we simultaneously don't have the workforce we need is not the solution. So there is a case to be made, but we have to point it out frequently and remind people of why this is important and that you're not doing this as charitable work for my kids in Cleveland. And if you are, you're doing it for the wrong reason. You're doing this to create a thriving a community that is inclusive for everyone and therefore actually reduces the burdens that we pay as a community over time as well.
I absolutely agree. And, one of the hardest things in public life is to change the status quo. I think we have to realize that you change the status quo over time, that you got to be in for the long haul. At various points, you point out the contradictions, but you also put in place the solutions. And you keep organizing people who are interested and those who are disinterested, so that one day you wake up with a core group of folks who are ready and willing to make the change. Again, it's not easy. It comes in fits and starts, but we have to do it if we want to have the community that we all want, which is one filled with opportunity.
And this is a critical moment because the pandemic has accelerated an examination process like never before. Many of us never thought that we would be working virtually, that, the conventional notion of going downtown to a set office space, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, working for someone and that ilk. And now people can work from their homes, from their laptops, from their cell phones. They can work many more different kinds of shifts than in the past. There are folks, businesses that often now are not even taking the office space that they used to take because they let the worker work and actually transfer to the worker a lot of the cost of doing business. And so that's another major concern that we have to think about is higher education. And we talk about economic mobility and workforce innovation, this idea that so much of what we could usually expect about safety nets in our country are changing as so much is shifting to the worker. You know, you're going to use your laptop, you're going to use your electricity, you're going to use your ink in your printer, so you can stay work at home, okay, but many of the cost of doing the business is now going to shift to the worker. You've got to, you're driving Uber Eats, which is fantastic, but it's your car, it's your gas, it's your insurance, all of the kinds of things that are shifting. So when business folks say, well, we can't find good people and so on and so forth, we've got to also be sure to raise the issue that if you're going to shift the cost of doing business to the worker, well, you're going to have to work on those wages, and you want a workforce that's going to be there for you. And so I think that in all this resetting, it is important specifically for education to be on the same page about the ways in which we look at the changing landscape for potential students and members of our community. Because as all these other resets happen, if we don't lean into this moment of possibility, because we are transitioning to a more post-pandemic economy and way and approach of doing things, if we don't leverage what we do have as sort of our knowledge and our skill and our heft in these conversations, we will miss a critical opportunity to help reset the table in a much more effective way that serves the people we are committed and dedicating to serve.
And I know we want to keep moving, but to build on this, this is where, as coalitions, we have to give very specific examples. And so building on what Dr. Baston said and pointing it out and making it visible, because it's so invisible to much of the sector. But I'm working with a colleague right now who has a doctorate degree, is moving home to New York City. New York is using a telework workforce like never before. New York also has an incredibly expensive cost of living for having an apartment. So every job that he's talking to wants him to work from home, wants him to have his own home office. Well, that's real estate. That's money in New York City. Cleveland, you can do that in Cleveland. In New York City, getting that second apartment so that you have your home, the second bedroom in your apartment, so you have your own home office. So he is rightly saying back to these employers, so are you going to increase the wage to offset the additional money I will have to pay to telework for you? Right? So we can use these examples to help people understand what the new economy is expecting of us as employers and as employer preparation. So that, again, we create more balance, that employee needs to have equal access to what he or she needs if that is going to become a match for that employer. And right now, it's still lopsided on the employer, as the more powerful organization can set this list of demands and hope that they're met. But we have to examine them much more carefully and use these examples to make them more visible.
Thank you. I have another question, one that came out of the question and answer session. And I think this is a good one for all of you or any of you. How can philanthropy encourage cross-sector collaboration to help set the conditions for long-term success in Cleveland?
Well, as a former philanthropoid, I believe that philanthropy is the research and development arm of society. And that means taking chances and taking risks. You start out with small groups of folk who are fellow travelers and those who are not fellow travelers. And you try and put them together as philanthropy, because only philanthropy can do that with its resources. And you start to build the case for change in any collective actions, collective impact sector. But philanthropy is the linchpin in getting folks together and supporting them to think differently and new about what is necessary to make things make things work.
Anyone else have any perspective on that, Eric?
I would agree exactly that philanthropy has the power to convene. They also have the power to provide the R&D and prototyping resources that allow us to examine how to reconfigure these partnerships, these systems, and then create a new steady state that is sustainable over time, which often, particularly in public sector roles like K-12 education or public institutions, we don't always have those resources to do that kind of prototyping, that R&D work that allows us to, think about how we reuse existing resources toward better goals. So I think the power to convene along with the power to resource the convening are particularly important.
I would just add the power of amplification. The philanthropic agencies have the ability, based on their mission, to really be megaphones on how we move together in meaningful ways to improve people's lives. That amplification through media, that amplification through clearly aligning the mission of the philanthropic agency with the work that's being supported, and the ability to really make sure that there are replications that can happen on the good work to make a difference. I think that is critically important. I think we do need the funds to do the research and development and the convening and all of that. I also think that there is a powerful ability to amplify the messages and to use their reputation capital with mission-aligned work, so that amplification not only helps us to spread the word, but also firmly show the way in which that philanthropic agency is believing in the mission by serving and putting us in the position to help others.
In our document, Resetting the Table, an Urban Agenda for Cleveland, one of the final considerations that we do put out is that reimagining philanthropy is a critically important aspect of this urban agenda, because we understand that not only do they have the power to convene and the power to help direct resources and the power to help do research and development and prototypical kinds of pilots. But the other thing that they have, the one thing that they will continue to have, is the ability to invest in things that will allow for us to innovate and create, so that we can transition from where we are to where we want to be. And that's a critical role. And I just think about that in the context of your comments here today, gentlemen, and just want to restate and echo the fact that all of these sectors that exist in our society, especially in our community here in Greater Cleveland, are critically important to us understanding how to do business differently and be successful as a community. Let me ask a general question, because all of you, both K-12 systems and higher education, are providing more supportive services and wraparound services for your students, such as food pantries, mental health services, and the like. We know that these social determinants of education directly affect learning and student academic outcomes. So how are your institutions addressing the human factor of how we help develop and sustain people as they go about their personal and career development?
I'll start with just a little bit about why we pursued Say Yes to Education as opposed to so many other promise opportunities, because there are other scholarship opportunities we could have pursued. The difference maker for us was that Say Yes to Education is not simply a scholarship opportunity. When we looked at scholarship programs across the country, we saw lots of scholarship programs that were helping middle-class communities finish filling the gap, while they weren't actually addressing the needs of people who are living in poverty and facing lots of other barriers. And so the Say Yes to Education wraparound services, which includes all the things you mentioned, food pantries, mental health services, physical health services, legal services, was our effort to create the capital and social capital that so many of my families just don't have access to, right? But what's more exciting for me right now in Cleveland, is as we look back on the mayoral campaign last year, the number 2 question was, have schools improved enough? And the answer is no, schools haven't improved enough. I say that as the school leader, but the 29 percentage point gain in graduation rates that we got while the poverty levels in Cleveland didn't budge at all. while lead had not been tackled in any meaningful way, while we had the worst digital divide in the country, and while we remained the ninth most racially segregated city in the country. And what I'm excited about is seeing, Mayor Bibb taking on not an education agenda, but a youth and family agenda, because that's where the social determinants are. I'm excited by Dean Anglin taking on the merger of the Urban Affairs College with the Education College, where education is a part of the urban community. It's not this separate thing. We're starting finally as a community, and Tri-C has done some great work with Dr. Johnson that I know Dr. Baston's going to continue around what is the role of the community member at the community college, of which student is just their job. It is not their whole identity. So I'm really excited about our community's visible shift in tangible ways to a youth and family agenda that thinks about education as an important role, but not as the sole function independent of all of these other social determinants. And that's really exciting from my point of view.
And I would certainly agree with Eric. The reason why Dr. Johnson and Tri-C have built these access centers around the community is that we recognize that it's not just an expectation that the folks in the community, particularly those who are economically fragile, can get to the campus, but that the campus can get to them, that they actually can get the resources within the communities that they live in so that they can rise. It will be very, very important for us to continue to ensure that people feel comfortable. Folks haven't always been trusting of systems because systems have not always helped the people as though they were supposed to. And so we've got to begin to reestablish a relationship of trust with the community. And one of the best ways to do that is to be embedded in the community, and not just with things that we think are important, but things that the community thinks are important to them. And making sure that as we continue to build these relationships through the systems, the K-12 through our university partnerships and all of these systems, that we speak with a language that embraces. When we look at trying to support students, we're not just here for the student, we're for their whole family. If we can impact that young child within the K-12 system, we don't just want to impact them. We want their mother, their father, their grandmother, their grandfather, their brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles, that we want them to know that as we are educating those young children, that we can support you in your journey, in your goals, in your hopes, in your dreams, and your aspirations, so that education is a family affair. And that's something that you will see and hear in a much more robust way as I come into to the college. How are we ensuring that we are impacting every member of that family? For any of our students that come to Tri-C directly or any of the institutions that our partners are in, how can we be a critical partner in making sure that that whole family is supported? Because if that whole family is supported, that community can rise.
Thank you.
From CSU's point of view, we are learning how to be a wraparound services institution for our students. We saw during and after the pandemic an alarming need to provide free food. So we have a food pantry. We have a new CARES management office that supports students facing issues outside of the classroom and which affects their ability to succeed academically. We have our living and learning centers, Parker Hannafin centers, which take some of CMSD students with Say Yes and provides wraparound learning, wraparound services in order to make them successful. So I think as we go along and as our president charts out her vision for the institution, we will see an increased priority on continuum of care for our students. We already have it in place, but we can do more. And we are struggling to find the best ways to accomplish that.
Thank you. I appreciate all of your comments. Eric, I'd like for you, if you could, for a few minutes, talk about a couple of things. You had mentioned earlier the PACE program, and I'd certainly like to hear more about the goals and your aspirations around that program. But also, if you could talk a little bit about the Greater Cleveland Consortium career consortium as well, it would be very helpful for us to get some idea of how we're connecting our attitudes around employment with those attitudes around educational attainment.
Sure. So I'll start actually with the second part, which is the Greater Cleveland Career Consortium. So the consortium we launched in March of this year, and it is a consortium of employers, of K-12 systems, including the district, but open to other systems in the region, of our community college partners and public institutions, of our career sector pathways, so IT, healthcare, I just drew a blank, sorry, about advanced manufacturing and architecture, construction, engineering, so the big career pathways in our community, of the philanthropy and public sector institutions, of the youth serving agencies and the workforce agencies. And the goal is to create a intermediary for a collective impact model, where we can recognize that employers seek employees from a regional approach. And so we have to have a unified approach to how that works. And so it is new, but has a large and growing membership of employers at the table, small and large, that is really examining this balance that I talked about earlier, about how do we create the open doors to get the employees that we all know we need in new and unique ways, that creates greater access for the employees that typically have been stuck on the sticky floor, right? And move them up into this good or opportunity job environment. And so it learns lessons from, for example, advanced manufacturing. So I had mentioned that while employers are often looking for young people who have job skills, advanced manufacturing figured out that, hey, 75% of high school students have jobs in fast food or in grocery stores. Let's recruit from fast food and grocery stores, because these kids have skills and we can train the advanced manufacturing on top of that. So it is a place where we can incubate and innovate collectively. And again, to do together what we can't do alone, what we haven't solved alone. So back into that then is PACE, which is the CMSD's particular response to helping young people in 6th through 12th grade have short and long experiences to do that choice-making, planning, career and workplace learning introduction, and then the deep learning while they're in middle school and high school. And so there's many ways that employers can be engaged in that. One of my favorite examples is saying to your employees, take your cell phone out and record a short video introducing yourself and the job that you do. And then drop it into this Dropbox, and we'll load it up so that kids can see, hopefully, younger people who are in the good opportunities but earlier careers. So it's a near peer, it looks like me, the person is younger like me. Hopefully they'll see many more people of color in roles that they haven't traditionally seen people of color in. They'll see women in roles that women have traditionally not been in. And they'll see that, for example, in healthcare, you don't have to like blood to work in the healthcare industry, because hi, I work in the legal department of the Cleveland Clinic. Here's what I do. Here's why my job's important. I'm from Cleveland. You can be me. And then we can code those into tools that kids can have these quick experiences with people in our community who are doing jobs that they may have never even heard of, and doing jobs that they may thought they would have never had access to. It's just one example of what PACE is designed to do to help kids really broaden their opportunities and connect it to their passions.
Thank you
And
so
just
much.
as I listen to Eric, now just think about if we partnered in a way that we could provide academic credit for the things that he's doing with the high school students so that they could get college credit, and we could provide additional support for them in these programs so that even those students would have another leg up as they're moving into their educational journey. And so that might be already in place or might be a thought already, but that's experiential learning. And experiential learning deserves credit too. And so that's an opportunity to broaden and to really demystify college-going culture in many of our communities, to say, oh, when you were in high school and you went through these immersion programs, when you got into this work-based learning, guess what? we find value at the collegiate level in that experiential learning. And we want to add this, or we could collaborate on pieces of it that would ultimately enable to make it credit worthy at the college. So what an incentive to students to say, hey, even if they're not in the AP classes, even if they're not in the college and high school program, but that they still could leave with some kind of college credit for the work they actually did to learn about becoming an engaged citizen in our community. So we've got to be thinking about those kinds of ways to connect.
Thank you. I'm going to now focus for the rest of our forum on those questions that were answered by participants in the webinar. So first, for all of you, can any of you talk about some of the most innovative approaches to education or career launching you've seen, not just here, but nationally?
Well, I guess I would say you're seeing some of it and hearing some of it in what Dr. Baston and Dr. Anglin and I are sharing. When we created PACE, and it took us, over 2 years and a lot of prototyping. I believe strongly in prototyping versus piloting, because piloting is my concept works and I'm going to prove it to you. Prototyping actually gives us permission to test and fail so that we can learn forward, right? So a lot of prototyping. People have come to us and said, where did you get this national model from? Well, we got it from right here in Cleveland by studying over 2 years and designing it. And it is those opportunities to take things that previously were experiential learning opportunities but weren't valued as mastering skills that therefore can be credentialed because you didn't sit in a seat for the required amount of time. So time has always been the constant, and then whatever you learned was the variable. And flipping it into what you're seeing increasingly in what Dr. Baston was just talking about, the way that the universities are rethinking, which credentials for which things. You're seeing more universities that have rolling term starts so that you can get smaller chunks at a credential that does ultimately lead to a terminal degree in many cases. And you're seeing the opportunities of learn to earns and internships and apprenticeships in very different ways. And then kind of the innovation that we have to watch for and really be careful to ensure meets its promise is that the credentialing strategies that we're moving toward become co-equal with the past credentials that we have valued, so that we don't just create a paper ceiling of, yes, you got those credentials and wasn't that nice that Dr. Baston and the Tri-C people gave you that opportunity, but you still don't have that degree and you're never going to be in the board seat. That's an equity question we have to pay a lot of attention to, is how do these continue to open doors instead of just create another inequity where, because we took these new pathways that got us further than the old pathways did, they still lead to a dead end compared to what the people who currently sit in the board seats, sit in the CEO roles, sit in the presidencies like we're doing today.
Thank you. I think what you're saying too is that for many of us, it's not just about what the outcomes are, but how do we connect those outcomes and leverage those outcomes so we can ensure that they have impact on the population in a way that's beneficial for them, as opposed to us just designing a system that seems to work. And I think that is truly an evolution in our thinking. It also is, as Dean Anglin was saying, it's going to take some time, because I don't think it's the orientation that many of us have or have had in the work that we've done. So I love the idea, Eric, that you use prototyping as a way to test and see if it's successful or fail. And as I always say to people, failure is not an end of itself. It's a learning exercise. So anytime we fail, we should glean information from that failure, and that should help us improve our next prototype as we move forward. Dr. Basson, you have discussed how the pandemic has changed the way we think about working and actually how we work. Can you talk a little bit more about how you've seen that change coming from New York and what has happened in your experiential context that has shaped your thinking about how you would approach that here locally?
I think critically important is now the way in which we talk about the work that people learn, the ways which people learn, the things that people do. We're talking about this concept of skillification, that every academic course has learning objectives. So it doesn't matter what course you teach or take, they all have academic learning objectives. Wouldn't it be wonderful, and what we're doing in New York is to say to our faculty and working with them, how do we highlight the 21st century skills that are connected to those academic programs and those courses so that we could enable our students to have a currency, a language that they could speak to a potential employer, not to just say that this is the class I took, but these are the skills that I have gained. These are the 21st century skills that I'm coming to your institution with because of what I learned. How is it that we can help our faculty members have a new architecture in the programs and in the classes that we offer so that we can embed work-based learning, so that we give our students more of a chance to actually have a level of expertise and skillfulness that will make them more employable and give them a competitive advantage. How do we have these conversations about the fact that our credentials should be stackable so that we could be able to give students shorter term credentials that would lead them to family supporting and sustaining wages, but that there would be this intentional ladder so that they would move from one opportunity to the next opportunity and see themselves rising economically. So in New York, we are doing a lot of this work around what we call a pracademic approach, that our academic approach has to be much more practical than it has been. And we've got to not completely dismantle the structures. And I appreciate Dean Anglin's points on this about the time it takes to transition, but to say that there are things we can do right now. You do have learning objectives in every course. You can look at the skills that students can gain from every academic course. You can use alternatives to the transcript, like digital wallets, where you can use a lot of different kinds of ways to demonstrate credentials for other. We can do digital badging. There's so much we can do that will allow us to be able to evidence that a person is knowledgeable and ready. And we've got to be very intentional. And that's what we're doing in Europe, being very intentional about skillifying our curriculum and putting our students in the best position to actually demonstrate what they know, what they can do, and how they add value.
Thank you. I'd like to pose one last question to Dean Anglin as it relates to, if you could identify some tangible next steps for leaders and institutions that they can take so that they can enhance their ability to collaborate and especially work towards benefiting young people and other citizens in our community.
Yeah. Let me build on what Dr. Baston just said.
Okay.
I found it so enlightening and remarkable. I said to myself, well, why can't the higher eds and the community colleges and the school district sit down in a room over time and figure out the micro credentials, the credentials needed to help these individuals progress in life? I don't think we do it at the moment. But for me, that's a tangible next step. It's something that's very concrete. It leads to outcomes that people can buy into, and it's transformative at the institutional level. And that's, I think, what I'm looking for if we're going to do a collective impact process. How do we transform the institutions based on our own relationships and partnerships and cooperation?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think that is a very pragmatic and tangible activity that we can engage in to be successful. So we will definitely want to follow up on that one. We're coming close to the end of our forum, and I want to offer each of the panelists an opportunity to make a final statement or make final comments before we conclude, and I'll wrap up.
I guess I'll start by just saying what I want to put together what Dr. Baston and Dr. Anglin said. We do have to play a long game. Getting the cultural ecosystems to change does take real time. But that doesn't mean we don't need to act urgently in the places that we can. And so, Dr. Baston, I was listening to you. I mean, one of the things that we expect of our students now is that when they're demonstrating their learning, and we have demonstration days where students stand up and tell you what they've learned, that what we're asking them to show us is both the academic content that they learned to solve the driving question and the transferable skills that they used and will take into the next learning experience or the next workforce experience. PACE is a 6th through 12th grade phase-in program. It will take me 6 years before every kid has fully experienced PACE, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't simultaneously be seeding the elements that are going to create the ecosystem change over time. And I think that's what you're hearing from all of us in this panel is playing the long game because we know that the system change requires it. And we know, particularly in K-12 education, that's almost never the strategy, but then knowing the urgent moves that you can take while playing that long game.
Dr. Baston?
Once again, it's been a pleasure to be with you and to be a part of this conversation with my new colleagues, the new members of my family. I am so looking forward to be a part of this community. And clearly, we have a sense of urgency. And I believe Dr. King has said it right, that there is the fierce urgency of now. We cannot wait for another generation to be dispossessed of opportunity. We have to tear down the barriers of opportunity and use this moment together collectively to build and strengthen the opportunity ecosystem. And I believe very strongly, with just hearing the voices of these extraordinary leaders, that there will be that commitment, particularly in the education sector, public education in Cleveland, to move us forward with all deliberate speed to help our community and build it up. So thank you for inviting me. I'm not even in fully yet, but you all were so kind to have me come today, and I really appreciate that.
And we appreciate you participating today. Thank you very much. Dean Anglin.
Well, I just want to thank my colleagues on the panel. I learned a lot, and what I principally learned is that we have goodwill, talent, and smarts in our community to address the issue of collective impact. And I hope that we can build on what we did here today and come back and think about some new and different strategies for making it happen.
Well, once again, I would like to thank all of you as panelists for participating today. And I would like to thank all the participants who have participated in this webinar today. This program has been recorded. So for those of you who would like to hear it again or tell your friends, you can find it on the Levin College website. It'll be available there for your listening and viewing pleasure. Also, we would like you to think about participating or joining us for our next forum. It will be held in the fall. Once again, PolicyBridge and Levin College will be looking at another topical area for discussion during that fall forum. And last but not least, I'd like to say for Randell McShepard, the chair and co-founder of PolicyBridge, and myself, we would like to just say how excited we are that this community has embraced the concept of developing an urban agenda and is thinking about how do we operationalize it in such a way that it benefits not just some, but every person in Northeast Ohio. And those connections that are necessary to be beneficial for years and generations to come. So with that, I will say thank you. Have a good day. Be well. Godspeed.